Contemporary America, from 1945 to present time. Post-World War II America, the Cold War. After the end of World War II, the United States came out confident and economically strong, only to enter a conflict with the Soviet Union known as Cold War in the late 1940s. It lasted more than 4 decades and shaped global politics. The constant threat of nuclear annihilation defined some of the influences in American literature during the second half of the 20th century. The 1950s and 1960s came along with many different movements. Among them, we have the women's rights movement, also known as women's liberation movement. It fought for equal rights and opportunities for women, along with their personal freedom. It is recognized as part of the second wave of feminism. The civil rights movement. It broke the pattern of public facilities being segregated by race and achieved the most important breakthrough in equal rights for African Americans since the Reconstruction period. Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and social rights activist. He was a leader of the African American civil rights movement from the mid-1950s up to his assassination in 1968. The March on Washington was held in Washington, D.C. in 1963, looking to protest about the racial discrimination. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. Members of the African American community were asked to stay off city buses on Monday, December 5, 1995, which was the day Rosa Parks would face trial for refusing to give up her seat in the public bus to a white passenger. With most of the African American community not riding the buses, organizers believed a longer boycott could be successful. This came to be known as the Montgomery bus boycott, and it was a huge success lasting for 381 days and ended with a ruling from the Supreme Court declaring that segregation in public transit systems to be unconstitutional. John F. Kennedy. His assassination and legacy. He became the President of the United States on January 20, 1961. He asked nations of the world to join together to fight the common enemies of man: poverty, tyranny, disease, and war itself. On November 21, 1963, he flew to Texas to give political speeches. While his car drove slowly in Dallas, he was shot and seriously wounded, dying a short time later. His death caused enormous sadness and grief among all Americans. His time in the office stands out in people's memories for his leadership, personality, and accomplishments. Some literary works inspired by this event are A Thousand Days by Arthur K. Schlesinger and The Death of a President by William Manchester. 9/11 World Trade Center. September 11, 1991 would become a day to remember for the entire world when 2 hijacked planes flew into the North and South Towers within minutes of each other, causing both towers to collapse and kill more than 2,000 people both in and out of the towers, and another 157 people that were on board the planes. This tragedy shook not only America but the entire world, and inspired literary works like The Dark Side, the inside story of how the War on Terror turned into a war on American ideals by Jane Mayer, and the 9/11 Commission report by Thomas Kean and Lee Hamilton. Barack Obama, the first African American to step into the office. He reformed healthcare, won 2012 presidential re-election, and received the Nobel Prize in 2009.
George Walker Bush. He was born in July 6, 1946 in New Haven, Connecticut. He was the 43rd President of the United States. He narrowly won the Electoral College vote in 2000, in one of the closest and most controversial elections in American history. He led the United States response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks and initiated the Iraq War. Before his presidency, he was a businessman and served as governor of Texas. As governor, Bush appealed to moderate Republicans and Christians in his own party. He implemented the philosophy of compassionate conservatism, which combined limited government and with concern for the unprivileged and personal responsibility. The previous government administration left the Texas Treasury in a surplus, so Bush pushed for a tax cut and increased funding for education. He promoted educational reform, tying teachers' salaries to students' performance on standardized tests, and signed into law legislation lowering the age at which juveniles could be tried in adult courts. He left the office in January 2009, leaving behind much unfinished business and low approval ratings. The country remained politically divided. Critics laid much of the country's misfortune at his feet, while supporters defended him for his strong leadership during one of the country's most dangerous periods. Donald Trump. He is the 45th President of the United States. He has ordered a travel ban on citizens from Muslim-majority countries. He has faced impeachment. He is the first president without prior military or government service. Now, we're gonna talk about some important authors. Martin Luther King Jr. He was an American civil rights activist. He wrote I Have a Dream, which was a speech that represents the hopes and dreams of all American blacks who have been struggling for their rights and freedom. He advocated for nonviolent methods of protests. Tennessee Williams. He was a dramatist and fiction writer. He was one of America's major mid-20th century playwrights. He is best known for his powerful plays A Streetcar Named Desire and A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. When he was 28, Williams moved to New Orleans, where he changed his name and revamped his lifestyle, soaking up the city life that would inspire his work, most notably the later play A Streetcar Named Desire. The 1960s were a difficult time for Williams. His work received poor reviews and increasingly the playwright turned to alcohol and drugs as coping mechanisms. In 1969, his brother hospitalized him. Upon his release, Williams got back to work. He churned out several new plays as well as memoirs in 1975, which told the story of his life and his afflictions. But he never really fully escaped from his demons. Surrounded by bottles of wine and pills, Williams died in a New York City hotel room on February 25, 1983. Sylvia Plath. She was born on October 27, 1932, in Boston, Massachusetts. She was a gifted and troubled poet, known for the confessional style of her work. Her interest in writing emerged at an early age, and she started out by keeping a journal. After publishing a number of works, Plath won a scholarship to Smith College in 1950. While she was a student, she spent time in New York City during the summer of 1953, working for a magazine as guest director. Soon after, she tried to kill herself by taking sleeping pills. She eventually recovered, having received treatment during a stay in a mental health facility. She returned to Smith and finished her degree in 1955. She met the poet Ted Hughes. The two married in 1956 and had a stormy relationship with. They had 2 kids, and unfortunately, the couple's marriage was falling apart. After Hughes left her for another woman in 1962, she fell into a deep depression. Struggling with her mental illness, she wrote The Bell Jar in 1963. Her novel, which was based on her life and deals with one young one young woman's mental breakdown, but she published it under another name, Victoria Lucas. She also created the poem that would make up the collection Ariel in 1965, which was released after her death. She committed suicide on February 11th, 1963. Maya Angelou. She was an American author, actress, screenwriter, dancer, poet, and civil rights activist, best known for her 1969 memoir I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which was the first bestseller by an African American woman. She was born on April 4, 1928, in Saint Louis, Missouri. She published several collections of poetry, but her most famous was the 1971 collection Just Give Me a Cold Drink of Water Before I Die, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. After experiencing health issues for a number of years, Angelou died on May 28, 2014, at her home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Ezra Pound. He was born in October 1885 in Hailey, Idaho. He was widely considered one of the most influential poets of the 20th century. His contributions to modernist poetry were enormous. He was an early champion of a number of avant-garde and modernist poets. He developed important channels of intellectual and aesthetic exchange between the United States and Europe. He published several successful books of poetry. Thank you everyone for your attention.